Good morning to everybody, or good afternoon for those of you who it's just turned afternoon. Welcome to webinar 4 in this series for the Leading Australian Resilient Communities. I'd first like to start today with acknowledging that we meet on different lands across Australia. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet, work and live, and recognise that this land always has been and always will be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander land. We recognise their continuing connection to the land, waters and culture, and pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to speak briefly about LARC, the Leading Australian Resilient Communities program. As those of you who've attended before, you know that we're rolling this program out across 10 sites across Australia with our lead delivery partners, who I'd just like to acknowledge: the Regional Australia Institute, the Leaders Institute of South Australia, Tasmanian Leaders, Leadership Victoria and Leadership Western Australia. This is, as I said, number 4 in a series of webinars. Today is Talking Tough Topics. And if you've been here before, you'll know that we have a couple of fantastic guests who I will introduce in just a moment. We'll have some questions, and that you are welcome to ask questions through the Q&A function, and anything else that you'd like to put in, please use the chat function. I'd like to start with introducing Caroline Robinson. I've got a bit of a blurb here, but I'll let Carolyn speak to herself as well in a moment. Carolyn is an enthusiastic advocate for rural communities and the leaders and organisations within them. She's a passion for assisting not-for-profits, government and member-based institutes through governance and strategy. Caroline combines extensive experience with a broad-thinking strategic approach to produce creative, people-centred solutions, connecting the people, services and information rural organisations need to help them expand and thrive in their community. Carolyn is the founder and former CEO of the Wheatbelt Business Network, the region's largest business association. She currently holds an executive officer position on the Northeastern Wheatbelt Regional Organisation of Councils, and has also held board positions on state government boards, rural not-for-profits, sports clubs, and the Regional Chambers of Commerce and Industry WA. In 2011, she was awarded the AgriFutures National and WA Rural Women of the Year, as well as the Shire of Narrabeen Citizen of the Year in 2018. Carolyn, thank you for being with us today.
Thanks, Andrew.
Our second guest is Rachel Chambers. Rachel's career has taken her on adventures through health, education, small business, board governance and local government. She is now the CEO of Queensland Fruit and Vegetables, Queensland peak industry body representing fruit, vegetable and nut growers. Rachel has always aspired to change the world for the better, to leave a legacy of doing good and being good. In the almost 6 years she held the role of the Mayor of the North Burnett Regional Council, she became known for her calm and considered approach, as well as her passionate and unrelenting advocacy. Her skills were honed in all kinds of management, such as disaster, asset, human, financial and water, as well as policy, legislation and politics. The role also demanded that she become a better team player, developing a thorough understanding of building a team of people with different skill sets, motivators and personalities. Through all these roles and learning, Rachel believes in carrying a kind heart, fierce mind and a brave spirit. She also believes that life is too short for bad movies, relationships, wine or coffee. I would challenge that you can make a bad movie good through the use of good wine. Rachel, thank you for being here today.
My pleasure, Andrew. Thank you.
We will get right into the questions. As I've said, today's topic is around talking tough topics and having difficult or courageous conversations. So I'll ask a question of both of you, and Carolyn, will start with you, and then I'll get Rachel to respond as well. Could you provide a sort of brief summary on the range of tough topics and courageous conversations that you've been required to undertake over your career so far? Obviously nothing privileged, but yeah, the context and the type of conversations you may have been across.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, so my background has been in the not-for-profit space and working with government, predominantly around governance and strategy. And probably what I've observed over the last 15 years of my work is that I've become more and more that middle person to facilitate some change or to have tough conversations. So in the not-for-profit space, some of my work's been around being an independent advisor for state sporting associations and going between them and 32 clubs and 7 winter sports associations with 1,200 players, and trying to create a better sporting competition and governance model. And that's been doing work at sort of individual level through to large, community meetings. In the not-for-profit space, I've done performance management, where I've had to sit beside board chairs or CEOs in a one-on-one environment, and also done some dispute resolution between members, and very difficult also when you're working in small towns, and being a mediator between clubs and personalities in those towns. In the government space, I've had to sort of work around brokering MOUs and contracts between local governments and not-for-profits, working with First Nations peoples around pest management and their engagement and how local government works with them, and also having tough conversations, as I'm sure Rachel has as a former mayor, around community priorities and how you manage them with limited local government resources when we do some forward planning. But across all of that, probably where I have the most tough conversations is when I'm the hockey coach in my local town, and I have to work and manage expectations of parents and children to ensure that they enjoy the sport and it's fun and they want to keep coming back. But by goodness, there are some tough conversations that you even have to have at that level. So yeah, that's a bit of my background.
Thanks, Caroline. And Rachel, what about yourself?
Yeah, picking up on what Caroline just said, I think sometimes it's not the quantum of the conversation that makes it tough. Sometimes it's who's involved in it, maybe the background and the history, what's to lose at the other end. So I think for me, one of the things I wanted to get clear right at the beginning is that I stopped calling them tough conversations or courageous conversations or difficult conversations a couple of years ago and started calling them necessary conversations. And that is to do a lot with my mindset going into it, in that this now is a necessary conversation that we have to have for a particular outcome. So that is quite calming for me to just change one word actually changes my mindset as to why we're having this conversation. So probably some standouts was when I had to make a person redundant after 29 years and they weren't ready to retire. And when someone has dedicated almost all their life to one particular job and one particular issue, that was what you would call a difficult conversation. But for me, it was a necessary conversation. It just had to happen. And I think one of the things for me is in all of these conversations, there's usually you and another party, and usually the responsibility, you find yourself in this predicament because you have the obligation or you have the responsibility. So as a CEO, I have an obligation for a safe working environment for all my staff. I can't sway from that, regardless of what conversations that become necessary. So another difficult conversation as a CEO is ending the employment of someone who had inappropriate conduct. Sort of the tricky part to that was they'd had inappropriate conduct for many years that had not been pulled up because it was a difficult conversation. So I think that you just sometimes have to say, I'm it, and be accountable, and that this is what you've signed up for. This is your role, whether you're the hockey coach, it still comes with that degree of responsibility that you've signed up for. I like the Nike just do it motto, in that you can't think about it too long, you just have to do it. And I suppose going back to my mayoral days, my mayoraldom, the Rock in a Hard Place tour was absolutely one of the fundamentally the hardest community consultation that we did. So we did 6 one-hour face-to-face sessions in all 6 townships. We had a tour that lasted 6 weeks. We asked direct questions and we answered them. So there's a 42-page summary still online about the Rock in a Hard Place tour, but that absolutely was very confronting and we had a lot of necessary conversations.
Thank you so much. Carolyn, just this is almost a continuation of what you just sort of alluded to in your response around the hockey teams, but these tough or necessary conversations, which ones do you find the more challenging, I suppose? The ones with one person, the one with a small group, or that room full of people?
Yeah, so they're all moments in time that are tough, I suppose. It doesn't matter who's sitting in front of you, because I think what you need to bring to it is a level of empathy, a real level of empathy around understanding what each of the parties, particularly if you're that middle person and you've got the skills to do it. But yeah, really listening and understanding each of their perspectives. And my big one is walking in each other's shoes. So they're both tough, but I'll go back one step as well and just say to Rachel that I like that idea of changing the conversation, and that it's a necessary conversation. And my bit to that is bringing what I call a courage muscle. So it's an internal muscle inside that helps drive some of these conversations. But when you're in a one-on-one situation and you're having to do performance management, or like Rachel said, you're retrenching a worker, you're in a small room generally and everything is noticed. And a key thing that I look for is behaviour and body language cues. And obviously they're more pronounced when you're one-on-one, and it might get it might get emotional. So you have to, make sure you don't buckle there. You have to, be quite strong. Whereas when I'm in large groups and I've had to facilitate big town hall meetings on really contentious topics, my role there is to keep an eye on the crowd and to look at who's speaking, but also more importantly, who is not speaking, and trying to get them to contribute to the conversation or the tough topic. So yeah, my body language is really important when I'm in those bigger situations. But yeah, if I come back to the thing that I try to carry across, whether I'm having one-on-ones or larger groups, is you must have empathy. And I'm a firm believer that when I have to have a tough conversation, I need to be really well prepared. And I'm looking at documents and things like that are the foundational pieces to that conversation, and using that as my measurement and my standard to start with. But always, it needs to align with my values, and I need to make sure that when I'm having those conversations, my values are true to the cause, and I've got a really good fit with why I'm having that conversation. A bit like Rach said, if you're the CEO, you need to provide a safe working environment, and that's one of my values is I want to look after people. So I'm quite happy to have that conversation.
Yeah. So Rachel, I might just ask you, picking up on Carolyn's thing about body language and being prepared. Many of us, and we might come back to this later, we do seem to have that fight or flight response whenever one of these necessary conversations comes up on our horizon. But that's the majority. Are you one of the rare souls who enjoys the challenge or the resolution of these conversations, or are you like the majority where the heart might start pumping, or at least you get a little bit mildly stressed? Where do you sit with that?
Absolutely. I don't think you would be a human if you don't get mildly stressed or concerned as to any kind of necessary or confronting conversation. That shows the level of empathy that you have. There's going to be an outcome that potentially another person either didn't expect, and that's even a bad thing, that they should potentially expect it. So no one enjoys it, but I agree with Carolyn. Having a plan is part of having the conversation. So I have tried to help management having those conversations, and we've actually got a mistake pro forma now, and it's about so we don't make a mistake in these conversations. A mistake is an acronym, and it stands for mindset. So your mindset is that it is a necessary conversation. It's not a confronting or a challenging conversation. It's a necessary conversation. It's about the I is for invitation. The invitation that you give to the other person to have this two-way conversation is important on how you phrase that. So it's, I would love to understand from your point of view about this particular topic. how are you looking for Wednesday, or things like that. So it's as much about the invitation as not just send an email again, we're going to talk about this. So it's invitation. It is about the space, as what Carolyn said. It's about setting up the space. And for me, my recommendations are always to have these conversations in the afternoon and have nothing after it, because either you'll be exhausted, or the people or multiple people will be exhausted, and it's probably not a good time to go back to work after that. So to, think about the space you're having in it. Think about how the two-way conversation, so T, the two-way conversation, and how you're going to talk. The A in mistake is for agreement. You have to come to some kind of resolution, that you're already in the room. You can't leave without some kind of go forward step. Otherwise, you're going to have to put it off and do it again. So there has to be some kind of agreement. It has to be done with kindness, and there has to be a level of expectations about where to from here. So we go in with that plan to try and calm everyone, to try and say, you know what, if as long as we step through it one by one, and then of course we've got some questions, guiding questions during different scenarios. No one enjoys it, but it can be less confronting if planned.
Thank you. It's awesome. I can almost hear people scribbling down that acronym and everything that it meant. I just have a question that actually came to me before this webinar that I was asked to bring up. This question was from someone who's worked across a number of regions and even states and territories in Australia, and they were curious as to whether both of you, our guest speakers today, found that it seems to be it's common in Australian culture that when we have to have necessary conversations, there's a level of nervousness, and if we're not prepared and not summoning that courage muscle, avoidance. They just noticed that in some other cultures it's perhaps not as strong, that people don't see it as a bad thing when necessary. What's your experience? Because you come from opposite ends of Australia and have worked across multiple sectors and regions. Carolyn?
I agree. I was thinking about, how I approach tough conversations, and it's really important to always, like, the one thing is around timing, and you need to pick your time to have those conversations. So as Rach said, you can plan for it, and you can have that meeting in the afternoon, etc., which might be good for that business environment. But when you're trying to have those conversations with people in your community, when you see them walking down the street, you have to pick your timing. And the other thing that I have learnt when I've helped organisations, or I've been in a leadership role in an organisation, is to tackle it early. Don't let it go on forever. If I've always got that motto of it's the standard that you walk past, and if there is something that needs to be tackled, it's around doing it early, which then goes into what you're talking about, Andrew, around that avoidance. If you can tackle it early, then you haven't got that anymore.
Yeah, Rachel, I can see you nodding there.
I agree, but I'm also interested in anyone else who has international workplace experience, because I haven't, and I think that culture set would play a lot into this kind of conversation. For me, I just look at Australia as that sort of traditional mateship, sort of easygoing, that sort of is part of our culture. That whole don't dob in your mate, those kind of things, I think, are definitely play into our Australian society and workplace. But for me, I can't actually accurately answer that question, but I'm very interested in the international differences.
Something to explore perhaps in the future. I'm just going to divert to a specific area, and we'll start with you, Rachel, because part of having necessary conversations, they come in all forms, and often we think of a one-on-one, performance review, or a meeting, but advocacy is also a conversation, or a type of conversation, and it can be a tough gig, tough to be heard, tough to get people to care or even understand. So I was wondering if you could share some of your strategies around or thoughts on effective advocacy as one of those types of conversations that need to be had.
This is really good timing because I wrote a board paper last week on effective advocacy. so it's great timing. So I've got a 3 and 2 rule in effective advocacy. So the 3 rule is data transcends party politics. So advocacy usually involves some kind of decision maker, and those decision makers usually are some kind of political persuasion. You know, there are times that that's not right, but particularly in my world that I'm speaking about, that's the world that we operate in. So data absolutely is necessary, because then you don't have to have an emotive conversation. It can't be swayed by different people's opinions and things like that. So, but the data is actually 3 stages. So data collection is 1. Data interpretation is the second bit, where you actually look at the data and interpret it to a particular statement. And data narrative is where we need to be in the advocacy conversation. So what is that story behind all of that data? So that first 3 is getting that data to tell a story in a very succinct and factual way, I think is important for advocacy. And the flip side to that is, and I had to explain this to the board, that successful advocacy is actually when someone else makes your ideas their own and runs with it. So you can't actually be attached and say, this was my idea and all the rest, because that's not your role in advocacy. Your role is to educate someone, to help them potentially see a way clear, to help them potentially understand a range of solutions. But then you want that person to adopt that issue as their own and start their own, you know, sort of advocacy platform on it. That unsuccessful advocacy is when you keep saying the same thing and you own that space. And I think potentially for me, that was a long-standing belief that you had to be the be-all and end-all advocate. And I think sometimes you get the job done much quicker and much easier if you choose the other way and upskilling a lot of other people to, you know, yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Carolyn, I can see you, that's triggering some thoughts for you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I really liked Rachel's comment there, that it's when someone else takes your idea on, that's when you've made your point across, which is fantastic. And Rachel, I'd love to see what you wrote in your paper for the board, because I am sure there are plenty of not-for-profits sitting around this table now thinking, how do we get into that space?
Caring is sharing, Carolyn. So happy to share.
Awesome. I just remind those who are viewing that the Q&A function is there. So now is your time. If you have questions for either Carolyn or Rachel or both, please share them and I'll make sure that they're asked. Obviously, both of you have been through contexts that have been challenging in different ways, and you've learned a lot. So if you, with all that you've learned through these experiences, and we have potentially 180 people viewing this webinar who all want to be able to have those necessary conversations in a better way. What have you learned that you would wish to impart to see people practicing out in the workplace, in their communities, in their businesses in regards to necessary conversations?
I'll take that if you want, Andrew, just because I want to pick up on the word that you just used, practice. So if there's one thing, you're going to get better with practice, just like everything else. And I think if you're going to do, if you're going to step up in a position or have a responsibility, and that first one's always going to be the hardest, it doesn't get easier, but it gets more familiar. And I think use the opportunities that Carolyn has said is in use those times where you really need to speak up early to start practicing those conversations before it gets too difficult.
Yeah, I think all the people, well, majority of the people probably sitting in on this presentation are based in rural communities. And one thing that I think really affects them, Andrew, is that when you live and work in your community and you have to have these necessary conversations, whether they're at individual or big town hall meetings, in a shire chamber, in your local sports club, in your workplace. It's really difficult to have those necessary conversations and have that courage muscle when you live and work in that town or across towns. So, you know, I encourage people to find, you know, people like myself or even people like Rach that have had those experiences, to get that information from them and to find out how they did it and what worked and what didn't work. But, you know, one project that I worked on, which was around this big sports project, what we ended up doing, because it was going across communities, we formed a little working group, which was people that self-nominated to lead conversations in their community around how sport needed to be in the future. And we all made sure that we were on the same messaging, so that when people, you know, stopped us down the main street or parents asked us at training, you know, we all spoke the same message roughly. And that group of leaders also ensured that they understood what the bigger picture was, and that, you know, there was an end goal to the project, and it was around making sure players, or making sure families all played sport on the one day in the one community, rather than, you know, travelling great distances elsewhere to participate in sport. But making sure that those leaders that were walking alongside me, we all supported each other, and we all understood that if we didn't have these conversations now, our communities would look really different in 10 years' time, and we'd be behind the 8 ball. So there, yeah, when you're in a rural community, to have those kind of conversations are exceptionally difficult. You need to support each other and have a strong internal conversation with yourself around why you're doing it, what the end outcome is, and why it's necessary, and work together to say the same thing, to get everyone along for the ride, if you're working at that community level.
Yeah, thanks, Carolyn. I think two really great points you brought out there was the importance of affiliation, of having people who speak a similar language and belong in a tribe loosely to support. And also, yeah, we often don't think that a conversation or a series of conversations is going to impact how a community is going to look in 10 or 20 years, but they sure can. Just as much as a government decision around infrastructure or spending, as much or even more, our conversations shape what our communities will look decades down the road. Thank you. I do have some questions coming through now. So I will ask, some of them are general, some of them are more specific, so situationally specific. So the first question is from Paula. What do you do if the person you are having a conversation with gets really angry? Rachel, you've never experienced this, and is just not listening or understanding anything you say. So if you both wanted to speak to that, that'd be great.
There is nothing to be gained from someone who is highly emotive at the time. That anyone who knows anything about physiology just knows that the brain just shuts down. You can't have a conversation. So always end it. In that, you know, we're just not getting anywhere, and I think that it's a really great time now that we break. 15 minutes, it potentially is enough. So in local government, you always have the opportunity to break any meeting in 15-minute intervals. So you can go in and you can, you know, delay it by 15 minutes. So try it at 15 minutes, come back at 15 minutes. Sometimes people will do that because they feel that if they did that, you would end the conversation and they would never have to revisit it. I think when you're ending it, make it very clear that we're ending it for this time, but we're coming back to do this. And you might have to do it 15 minutes. You may have to get to a stage where, okay, we're going to have to make another time, and it's tomorrow or it's whatever. It can't be delayed. And I think potentially if the person doesn't want to have the conversation, you may have to take another route. And then it's not a difficult, you know, a necessary conversation, it's a necessary process.
Yeah. Carolyn?
I think this, agree with Rach, this depends on whether it's a one-on-one or if it's in a group environment. So when I've had people quite angry in a one-on-one situation, if it's in a professional capacity and I'm sitting, you know, in a business or in a meeting one-on-one with them, I just will listen to them and I reverse the question back onto them. So apologies if anyone's listening online and has seen me do this, but you try and ask them, well, what would you do? Or what would you like to see done better? Or, you know, reverse it. If it was, if you're standing in the pub and you've got an angry person, well, that's not the format. So that's quite easy. You can just walk away. And if it's in a meeting situation, agree with Rachel, you need a really strong chair that's going to have the ability to adjourn the meeting or have a break. And, you know, I go back to that same thing. It's around empathy. It's around, there's a reason why they are fired up about it, and you need to walk in their shoes and find out why, and then, you know, communicate back to them how you're going to, you know, resolve their issue or, you know, come halfway with them. So walk in their shoes and understand, but it very much depends on whether it's one-on-one or in a meeting, as Rach said.
Can I just add, Andrew, that some of my greatest adversaries have been my greatest advocates after doing what Carolyn has just suggested. So sometimes taking the time to just explain the entirety of the situation, which if it's in that group situation, sometimes you need to make a time after that to say, wait, you know, I really want to discuss this with you, but it's going to have to be one-on-one because there's so much information that obviously we need to talk about it. We can't talk about it in 5 minutes. We're not going to resolve anything. Out of those conversations have become my biggest advocates because once they get it, they get it and they cease being angry and start sort of understanding. So Carolyn's absolutely on the money with that as well in a community sense.
Yeah, and a short diversion before I get back to the questions that we've got coming in. A specific thing. Either of you would be great to share effective chairing. Ineffective chairing seems to be one of the great scourges of getting volunteers in rural Australia because no one wants to sit through 3-hour meetings and accomplish nothing. So I imagine that both of you have a lot of experience in this. Quick tips for being effective chairers of meetings, if you can pull them out of the hat real quickly.
Yeah, I'll go first on that, Rach, because this is my absolute passion point, working with not-for-profits. Meet only when you need to meet. Let's be fair about that, because sometimes we might be an organisation that meets every month when actually you don't need to meet every month. So, you know, meet for a real purpose. And meetings are there to make decisions. They're not there to discuss. It's decision making, unless you're in a staff meeting. That's something different. But the other thing with chairs is your role is to facilitate the meeting. Your role is there to get the most out of everybody sitting around the table and to ensure that everybody is heard. So chairing a meeting, if you can think in the back of your head, is around that. It really is a facilitation role. It's about asking for opinions and trying to get some sort of consensus to make that decision. Rach?
Yeah, chairs facilitate conversations. They don't have conversations. So if you're going to do it badly, then get a chair who you just listen to the chair the whole time. So also stick to an agenda. So meetings without an agenda usually go wayward. So stick to the agenda and stick to time. So if you can look at the agenda, and the meeting usually has a 2-hour time slot. If you can do that in an hour, make the agenda an hour, even though you usually have a 2-hour meeting. Just on an offside, disaster management meetings all over Australia are 45 minutes. So in a disaster situation, you are supposed to be able to chair a meeting and listen to every single part of every emergency and disaster, make decisions, come to consensus, etc., within 45 minutes. So after that training, it really helped me scope. And I'm not saying that I have got my chairing under control. It will depend on who is in the room, there's topics in the room, there's all sorts of different variables, but I also know that I should be aiming for 45 minutes.
Carolyn, I'll just admit that I've sat in the room when Rachel's chaired a meeting. I was always very well behaved. All right, moving on. I've got a question here. Any tips for necessary conversations when you're going up the chain of command? So, for example, through to the boardroom or through to higher management. That's a question from someone.
I saw that one come through, Andrew, about, I think it's the one, if you're not the person who is empowered to make a decision. I think I would question about that empowerment, in that in every situation as a human, if there's a conversation that is necessary, I think that you have this overwhelming obligation to talk to someone about it. So you may not be the ultimate decision maker, but for me, you should still be empowered to have that necessary conversation with whoever you need to have it, with. In that, in a organisation, there's usually an organisational structure. I think the problem lies with potentially not your role or obligation to have it, but potentially the willingness of someone else in your organisation to have it. And I think that potentially in this forum, you've got 180-ish people who know they have to have necessary conversations, because we all do. Not one of us is getting out of here without having a necessary conversation in life. I just think that part of the issue is, if you've got a willing participant in that, it's much easier to have a conversation. I think potentially what we're talking about here is when the people or person you need to speak to is unwilling to have the other side, because of course you might as well be talking to yourself if you don't actually have anyone else invested in the conversation. So I don't know if that answered it, but I think that if you know you need to have a conversation, then you just need to find a way to have that conversation. Because otherwise, going back to Carolyn's values, in that I always base it on, can I sleep at night knowing I did everything I could do? If you're lying awake at night going, wow, I really need to tell someone something, then you probably need to do something about it in any way you can.
Yeah, and I'd agree with that, Rach. My other question that I ask myself is, when I am finding a blocker above me, if I was in an organisation and they're not willing to listen or have that conversation higher, is if I can't influence it, is it worth it? Like, it's around what's in my control and what's in my control space. And if it's really important and it needs to happen, well, then I've got to work damn hard to have that conversation and help. The other thing is, one thing that I have seen in not-for-profits, when you've got a staff and you've got a volunteer board or a paid committee, is often they don't know the lines of communication or the delegations of responsibility or the delegations of authority as well. So having murkiness around what your role and your responsibility is and how you communicate with others in your team or across operations to strategy at that strategic level with the board is often creates confusion. So if you need to go back to as you said, Rach, your organisational structure, go through the proper process first, and if it doesn't work that way, look at having a broader conversation or going another way up to the committee or the board in a respectful manner. But yeah, understand those lines of communication and authority and what your role and responsibility is. And once you've got that nailed, then you can move within your structure to have that difficult conversation and hopefully move that person who's being the blocker, or if you're feeling not empowered enough, hopefully you can make a difference just through understanding that.
Mm. Would it be a fair statement too that in having those conversations and wanting to raise awareness and getting someone to care, while it's great to have passion and emotion, but referring back to what you mentioned before, right, the data, making sure that the conversation is driven by data, not just your own personal passion or emotion? Absolutely. Yeah. We've covered this a little bit, but I'll ask it for Nadi. It says, what is the best approach to invite someone for a necessary conversation if they themselves refuse the initial invitation or are so set in their ways and can't see other parties' issues or are not willing to open up to resolutions or future expectations?
Well, that's an easy one.
Thanks, Nadia.
I think in this case, you probably have to delve deeper, like what Carolyn was suggesting before, in that, do you then understand where the fear, and I did see another question about people sometimes are upset and angry due to a fear-based reaction. So what are they fearing? And someone once told me that change, head, heart, feet in change management. So some people will react with any kind of change or any kind of fear-based model in, it's all in their head. So they'll be going through all the potential and possible scenarios and make it like this. And the way to counteract that is education. So if someone is having a head-based reaction to a change management process or any kind of change, then educate the person who's having that reaction in their head. If they're having a reaction in their heart, then it's about support. So that sometimes if they're really upset and they're having that really emotional thing, it's about more support than education. And then if those two things can't work, then their feet will react. So they will either run away and not come back, or you actually need to move them with your feet. So I've taken that on board as a very simplistic way of dealing with people's fear. But I think potentially for the question that you asked initially, it's that I think would have a lot of different factors. And if that really simplistic way of just inviting them and they're not coming up, you're going to have to dig deeper and you're going to have to find out where the fear is, what are they concerned about? And you might have to go one by one. And do you need a third party in the room? Do you need to have, and you always have to offer a support person anyway, but do you need a different place? Do you need a different time? Would you like more information about what we're going to talk about? Keep trying until you sort of reach those pain points would be my only advice, and good luck.
Yeah, I fully agree with that, Rach, and you can apply that both in a business setting, in your workplace, and also out in the community when you're working with communities or having those difficult conversations. The other one too is to work out where they sit in the whole sort of greater piece, whether it's an organisation or it's within the community. And are they a leader in that space? And if they are, then you really need to do quite a lot of work with them and find those times when you can have those conversations. If they become really bullish and you have tried what you have just said, Rach, where you've looked at the head, the heart and the feet, then I'm a big one for that 80-20, and you keep on powering through, particularly if you believe in what you're trying to do or, progress that change. It sometimes it has to come down to that majority, and this is what the majority is, and this is where we're going to. But you only get to that stage when you have done everything and you've exhausted as many different mediums and communication methods as possible.
Yeah, thank you. This nicely leads into this next question, which is sort of links to, I think, to self-care, because obviously these necessary conversations, they demand something of us both mentally, emotionally, psychologically. So this question is, have you observed that people who do a good job in leadership or decision-making positions, who are constantly having to navigate necessary and difficult conversations and perhaps have been burnt in the past or suffer from overwhelm, can they tend to disappear and or potentially lead to poor decision making? I suppose, I'll let you answer that, but also if it does have that effect, what do you do to look after yourselves to be able to keep showing up in that space in a positive way?
Yeah, that's a big one, Andrew. And I go back to the majority of people that are probably on this presentation is that, we live and work with each other and we know each other very well, and we have to still have friendships and still see parents at pick up and drop off, even when we're having these conversations. it goes up for me personally. It comes down to two things. One is around my values and making sure that I am doing the right thing and I'm being a kind person, like Rach was talking about. That is, and I'm being, I'm demonstrating empathy. That's a really big one, because I would like to be, I have that rule that I'd like to be treated, what is it? You treat people how you would like to be treated. So that's my fundamental thing. And when you are in those tough times and it is getting a little bit on top of you, the common word of lift your head is really important. And you have to rise above any personality differences or any conflict that's happening in that situation, and lift your head and look at the end game about where you're going. And that could be in a local government chambers room. It could be at your sports club. It could be in your P&C meeting, school boards, in your workplace. But lift your head and don't get too bogged down in the personalities that sometimes emerge. If it sits really well with you and you know that you're trying to do the right thing by other people, it will eventually work itself out and it'll come through. And for me personally, I have a very good friend that I talk a lot to, and my husband, good luck to him because he gets it at home. But you've got to talk through it with people that are not in that space sometimes to just have a download.
Yep. The peer-to-peer network for me is absolutely vital. So the amount of times I have lent on a whole range of people, and it doesn't have to be, so when I was mayor, it didn't have to be a mayor. It could have been a CEO or a bureaucrat or someone else. It doesn't have to be at the same level, but just for insight and, how else could I do this? And actually asking the question, and that continual professional development, in that if I wasn't asked to speak today, I would have really liked to have been the one that asked the questions of a speaker. So just having that, you're never going to nail this. There's always going to be room, and it's all like every leadership role, you're always going to have room to do things differently or improve or anything like that. So that's really important to me. Someone, when I was first elected mayor and I was really struggling with the weight of the world on my shoulders, said to me, Rachel, think about it this way: 95% of people won't give a crap about what you do in your day job. You'll only hear from the 5%. If you focus on the 95, you're going to be okay. If you focus on the 5, they're going to bring you down. So for me, it was just in the back of my head, always focusing on, like you said, the bigger picture. You're never going to hear from people who think you're doing a good job. And if we all think about all the necessary conversations that we have been privy to from a distance, so we've seen them happen. So either we've seen Caroline in the town hall meetings and we're like, whew, I'm glad it's not me, or we see politicians coming up and making a ruling and all the rest. I think that even though potentially we may disagree with some of those things, and that's human nature, to get a majority, it's called 51% for a reason, because there's a whole lot of disagreement. You don't always get 90 and 100% of people agree. But I think that the majority of people deep down respect the person who is brave enough to have the necessary conversation. So even if you can just concentrate on, you were the one, you've had the conversation, it needed to be done, and you'll never hear from the 95% of people who had your back silently, and don't get bogged down on the 5% that will try to bring you down come what may.
No, thank you. Thank you both. Just a question on, as you look around, Australia, different organisations, are you looking anywhere and are there certain individuals or certain groups that you look at and think, wow, the way they have conversation, the way they make decisions, if I could get some of that, I'd be on the way. Or have there been historically? Yeah.
Yeah, Andrew, I've had a lot of people, both within my own region but abroad, outside of my region, that have really helped me, and there'd be way too many people to mention, but I take something from the way they do things, and I'm always learning from them. I've seen some fantastic local government representatives that are calm and measured, and I'd love to have an element of that. The other really good one that I was just reading about was, I'm pretty sure the book was called How to Have a Good Life, which was the study about a Harvard study that looked at relationships since the 1930s, and you know, it tracks all these people and their families and how they've gone about life and their learnings and their experiences and their decisions. And yeah, if I think about having these necessary conversations and these tough moments, it all boils down to relationships and understanding each other. And yeah, if you want to read a book, pick that one up, because it just teaches you about yeah, how you work together and how you have a good life and the importance of relationships. And I think when you understand that, and you understand other people and where they're coming from and why they possibly say what they say and do what they do, you will go far, I think, because it just comes down to people and being good people to each other.
Yep, everything's human. Everything's human, and it doesn't matter if, and we talked yesterday, so I'm at a national trade and market conference in Canberra, and we talked yesterday about the trade negotiations between countries, and the trade negotiations between countries, which are necessary, but I could imagine they're quite difficult conversations as well, is when people talk to each other in a room on the other side of the country. It's the relationship, it's can I trust you, it's what are your intentions, are you telling me the truth, are you all the rest. So every single thing we do is about being human. And I think to Caroline's point, in learning human is part of what every leader should do. Every leader needs to learn human, and I have done some of the Australian World Leadership stuff, and some of it's about learning human. First you have to learn yourself as your own human, and then learn other people and how potentially you react in that environment. But everything, you cannot think of something in life that doesn't have a human element. And if we're talking about books, there's a book called Scary Smart that is talking about AI into the future. And they talk about that by 2029, and if anyone who's used ChatGPT recently knows how fast this is going, by 2029, the AI is going to be 1 billion times smarter than the smartest human. So to put that into some kind of relativity, it's like Einstein and a housefly. So we're the housefly and the AI is going to be Einstein. So there's no turning this AI stuff off, because if you write into the code about this, you know, pull the cord or whatever, they actually have already worked out how to circumvent that and all those. But they talk about that as much as all of that AI stuff we use it, apparently by the time you get up in the morning and have your coffee, you've already used 20 forms of AI that you don't know about. So if anyone thinks that it's on the horizon, it's actually being used every single day now. But what they're saying is what is missing is the human content of AI. It's that moral and ethical source, and that is the scary part of Scary Smart, in that humans have a lovely way of in disaster or in emergencies coming together and having that empathy for one another and having that feeling and emotional support. And this book actually says it's up to all of us to train the AI now to have that outcome, that we actually have to teach human to a machine, which I think is just a fascinating concept.
Certainly a great responsibility, and emphasizes the point that the conversations we have now are going to shape our world in coming decades. We are almost out of time. I just wanted to ask both of you if there were any final words in regards to, and I think we'll rebrand this now, this whole thing of talking necessary topics or necessary conversations. I love that, Rachel. Thank you for bringing that change in mindset to us. Yeah, final words for those who are listening today or will be listening to the recording in the future.
Well, thanks first and foremost for the opportunity, and really loved this conversation and the questions that came in. So thank you very much. I think it goes back to a little bit what Rach said. You know, it's about practicing, and you'll never develop your skills in this area if you don't, take the lead and have those necessary conversations. And if you are fearful or frightened, just come back to your values and just make sure that what you're having that conversation about is really aligned to what you do and why you do it and who you do it for. And when it is like that, you'll find the conversation is a lot better. And always remember that the other people on the other side are probably just as fearful as you in this conversation. So yeah, you'll be fine. You'll be fine.
I feel better already, Carolyn. Thank you. I would say your mindset, everything that we're talking about is about a mindset, that your mindset has to be right. So if you go into any of these conversations, like if you go into your day with the wrong mindset, you're going to have perverse outcomes. So if you could concentrate on one thing, it would be getting your mindset right, and that this is a necessary conversation. We're going to do it with kindness. It needs to produce an outcome, and this is just where we are. It's we're going to do it as in a most loving way as possible, because we are human and we know people go back to their families, and we know that people have other issues coming to either the community or the workplace. We're just going to be kind as possible.
Great. Well, thank you both so very much. I love that about the courage muscle, and I do remember listening to a psychologist who said when people are facing fears, whatever that may be, elevators, frogs, social spaces, often for many, the more they're exposed, they don't actually have less fear. They simply become braver and can face more and more. So yeah, Caroline, as you said, exercising that courage muscle and doing it again and again and again. So everybody, thank you for your attendance today. We really appreciate all those who've spent an hour with us and sent in some great questions. I just remind you that this webinar is part of a series. If you haven't seen the first three, I'd encourage you to go onto the ARLF channel on YouTube. You can see all of our conversations in the LARC channel. And in next month, we'll be having a slightly longer conversation, hopefully for 90 minutes, on regional well-being. Rachel, you might want to tune in and listen to that. I know that was one of your passions for a long time, probably still is. But everybody who's listening, please join us and get reminders for the next webinar. Caroline Robinson, Rachel Chambers, from the Foundation, to you, we thank you so much for your time. We appreciate the wisdom, experience. We know how valuable your time is. So for giving us an hour today, we are really grateful. And I'm sure all our participants are grateful as well. So thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. Good luck.